Hello and welcome back to The Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we'll be diving into the new post-Rick era of the TV version, and of course, the much-awaited lead-up to the Whispers. Now that Rick, Maggie, Carl, and countless others are gone, we'll be tackling things out of order here and there, so like I've been saying for the past couple of retrospectives now, don't be too surprised if there are major disparities between the two versions. That's just how it is. These direct comparisons will soon become basically impossible. But let us not waste any more time and dive right in. When we left off in the comic book, Rick finally caved and agreed to let Carl travel to the Hilltop and learn blacksmithing. And so, they say their goodbyes and get ready to head out. Though not before Anna hands Carl a letter, which Rick, being the pushy dad that he is, immediately teases him about, saying that it's a love note. If you recall, Carl mentioned Anna to Negan before when they were talking about relationships, so this isn't the first time she has popped up. Though yes, I will spoil the surprise, the note does indeed turn out to be her expressing her feelings toward Carl. It doesn't really amount to basically anything in the grand scheme of things, and more so just characterizes Carl, with him first being apprehensive toward her in general, and then saving the note saying that today was a good day, a good letter won't make it any better, a bad letter will make it worse. So effectively, it's just a case of him being a bit standoffish in general when it comes to relationships, and also conveying this now more mature side of him. But with that, they both head out on their journey to the Hilltop. Do keep in mind that in the comic book, we are still largely in the introductory phase of the post-Timeskip story. And so, this little trip also largely functions as just more exposition of all the progress they've made during those 2 years. The fact that just the two of them can now freely travel these long distances already speaks for itself, and then moments later, we also see these patrols all along the roads. Well, actually, not all the roads, but hold that thought for a minute. Another fun thing we see here is just some good old dad banter with Rick, with them awkwardly talking about taking bathroom breaks and going off into the woods, relationships, etc, etc. As per usual, I do think that Kirkman was just baiting us into a false sense of security again, just like he had already done with the prison, Alexandria, and basically every other time we felt safe. And this would be particularly true in just a moment. Though after they've been on the road for a while, they notice some walkers stumbling out of the woods. And while on the face of it, I mean, come on, this is The Walking Dead, this is no big deal, right? But no, this absolutely should not be happening. Rick and Carl are traveling by the main trade route between the communities. One that is patrolled around the clock to ensure that even completely unprotected trade caravans could travel freely. In the show, this is never really explicitly addressed, both because of the whole pseudo-conflict disconnectedness of the communities, but also because travel in the TV version has just always seemed a little wacky. I mean, sometimes travel takes a day by car, sometimes it only takes a few hours. Sometimes it takes a few hours by horse, sometimes it takes a day. It's never really seemed entirely consistent. But that's beside the point. Rick gets off the carriage and goes to kill the walkers, and while his hatchet skills are still solid, he hasn't exactly spent the past couple of years fighting, and so he is also quite a bit rusty. Do keep in mind that at this point, in the comic, the time skip was longer than all of the time they've spent in the apocalypse combined. So yeah, 2 years behind walls, plus all of his injuries, he isn't exactly in peak physical condition, and so things quickly take a turn for the worst. Luckily, Carl is there and shoots the walkers, and upon hearing the gunshots, the patrolman finally arrives. Just like I mentioned with the Season 9 videos, in the comic, while Rick is a lot more at peace nowadays, he has certainly not lost his edge when it comes to leadership. And that is exactly what we see here. As Benjamin rides up, and yes, this is Benjamin, but he has literally nothing to do with the TV version of Benjamin, he apologizes for what happened, saying that they were just patrolling here and that it was clear. But he then notices that this is Rick of all people, the literal leader of their entire trade network and community network. And so, his apology quickly turns into complete horror as he realizes he almost killed the legendary Mr. Grimes. Rick, however, calmly tells him to not apologize, but rather explain.
You put your name in a goblet of fire.
And then calmly adding, "Get off your horse." And as he does, Rick goes full Savior's era Rick as he begins repeatedly bashing him over the head with his cane, yelling at him about lying and then screaming that this is their trade network's main artery, telling him that countless people line up for his job, that he is useless and that he and his son could have died. Composing himself, Rick then asks for his name and residence, saying that this better be your first report. And as they prepare to head off once again, Rick tells him once more to think about all they have sacrificed and worked for. His position is one of the most important they have. So again, as much as I clown on Rick beating him with a cane, this entire unity aspect of the communities is much more prominent in the comics than it was in the show at this point, or to be totally honest, basically any other point in the future. As they near the hilltop, we see another case of Rick's status being reinforced as he is immediately referred to as Mr. Grimes and is then personally escorted into the community. And as we see Rick greeted by Maggie, he is also swarmed by people just wanting to meet him. And this is where he mentions that this is why he changed his appearance. He cut his hair and grew his beard out, just trying to escape the limelight, but clearly it didn't work. This is kinda sorta what we saw in the TV version as well, though I do think that the angle of Rick being this god among men was just always played up a tad more in the comic. And again, at this very moment, while there are some fundamental disagreements about Negan between Maggie and Rick, their communities stand 100% united and they are still very close friends. Negan and the Saviors are in fact never even mentioned here. As for Carl, he makes his way to see Earl, though unbeknownst to him, he isn't the only one who wants to learn blacksmithing, with Roland, or Roland, I don't know, already apprenticing under Earl. Thinking that this spot has already been taken, Carl just walks off, clearly being upset. And again, I'll spoil the surprise for you, this whole thing is just blown out of proportion. Just a short while later, Carl would actually talk to Earl about it, and then he'd just ask, "What made you think I could only have one apprentice?" And so, he'd start learning just as planned. Though in the broader story, like I already mentioned before, I do think this sense of normalcy was just subtly making us lower our guard for what's about to happen. I don't mention this for simplicity's sake, but this entire story at the Hilltop is going on at the same time as Ken and Marcos. So Kirkman, in his usual evil way, was just creating this intense emotional dichotomy between this new world behind the walls and the unimaginable horrors we'd soon meet back out there. As for the TV version, because this is now our second multi-year timeskip of Season 9, we yet again have that new beginning vibe all over again. In terms of Alexandria, we of course see that the community itself has also changed quite a bit again, and now actually resembles the comics version post-timeskip as well. Meanwhile at the Hilltop, Jesus is now the leader because Maggie decided to become a super cop. Though fun fact, the song Jesus is listening to is called April Skies, performed by The Jesus and Mary Chain. So yes, amusingly, Jesus is indeed listening to a song by The Jesus. As for the kingdom, we see Henry, who is now obviously a teenager and similar to Carl in the book, wants to go to the Hilltop. As you might suspect, yes, he will be our Carl step-in for much of the story to transpire. Minus his ending, of course. Though just like Carl, he wants to become a blacksmith, Ezekiel doesn't really want him to leave the kingdom, but ultimately they cave, and so he and Carol both set off. Like I've mentioned many times already, the comic story is almost always much more linear in scope, so after the war, we don't really follow the Sanctuary, the Kingdom, or even the Hilltop that closely. Of all the communities, the only one we ever really catch up on is the Hilltop, and that's just because Maggie, Carl, and Sophia are there. The others we barely, if ever, see. And also, Ezekiel here begins mentioning the fair, which is of course referencing the not-so-fun fair at the end of the season. Obviously, the major difference here being that, in the book, this fair happens at Alexandria, while in the TV version, it is the Kingdom. I think it makes perfect sense with Ezekiel being the one to head it up, because, I mean, it's Ezekiel, but I did always like how Alexandria was the absolute heart and soul of the Joint Alliance. So I do still kinda prefer it taking place in Alexandria, just because it hits closer to home. Though as with most things in the comic story, I am quite biased there. As for Carol and Henry, they set out for the Hilltop, only Carol decides to take a little detour to everyone's favorite forest-dwelling hermit, Daryl. And unfortunately, as you might suspect, because Daryl doesn't exist in the comic, neither does Dog. And that is frankly a travesty. Jokes aside, because literally everyone involved here is TV exclusive, so is this entire storyline. But to be honest with you, I absolutely love this direction for Daryl. We've seen many times already that, for better or worse, Daryl is as loyal as you can be. Whether that is to Merle or Rick or even the communities as a whole, he will go the extra mile. And so, because he never found a single trace of Rick, someone who he clearly considered family, he does become this recluse, just going in circles around where it happens. Obviously, we now also know that Leah was mixed in all of this, but as of right now, the implication, which I think many tend to forget, is that yes, he did spend 7 years just looking for Rick. Tragically, that survivor's guilt never went away. And like we talked about last time, Rick was ultimately the person who largely brought him back into society as far back as Season 3. And with that connection severed, I mean, yeah, he does sort of lack a purpose. And in a broader sense, I also love the trope of having these immensely powerful and important characters just somewhere out in the world. And we then have to go out of our way to find them just somewhere in this forest or something. I mean, yes, it is a huge fantasy trope where this one old, wise wizard just lives somewhere deep in the forest by himself or something like that, but Daryl really gives off those vibes here too. Especially with the whispers coming into the picture, it's like, hey, it's time to go get Daryl. Back on Magna's side, we see them meet up with the bigger group where, similar to the book, discussions begin about potentially bringing them into Alexandria. Which is cool and all, but unfortunately, this is already where my many problems with Judith begin. Because why the f is she outside of the walls? Literally 2 episodes later, Michonne says, Hilltop is here, Kingdom is there, and Alexandria is there, and between that is a whole lot of broken world. And like, okay, I very much agree with that, but then why the f is your daughter running around said broken world? You lost your husband on a construction mission with dozens of people running around, but you feel perfectly fine sending out a 9-year-old child with such a small squad? I mean, obviously, I'm not silly, the simple answer here is the rule of cool. Clearly, they just thought introducing Magna through Judith and her little, my name is Judith, Judith Grimes, would be very cool, and yes, admittedly, it was pretty cool. But at the same time, like, can we not? Think about it, the entirety of the early Walking Dead story was a struggle of Rick keeping his son alive in this broken world. So how about we don't undermine literally all of that and have a 9-year-old running around the woods? That aside though, everything about Magna's group is far more interesting in the TV version in my opinion. In the comic, their entire group always seemed to have a very utilitarian goal of just driving a bunch of drama and that's about it. Whereas the TV version really fleshed them out to be these diverse and interesting characters. And on that note, probably the biggest change here is that Connie is deaf in the TV version. And personally, I have always loved these sorts of changes. The Walking Dead is ultimately a story about people surviving in the apocalypse. And so to me, it's just as simple as it is interesting seeing more diverse people and how their stories differ. There's a reason why we never saw Morgan and Dwayne together, for example. We already have Rick and Carl. Purely from a story writing perspective, we don't need a father caring for his son. We'd be retreading those same exact story beats. But now with Connie, we open up an entirely new dimension of storytelling. And I, for one, think that is very neat. And yes, it also gave us what is easily one of the best duos in the TV version in Connie and Daryl. As for the interview, it mostly goes down the same as the book, with the only major differences being that, in the show, they have this entire council making decisions instead of just Rick, and also, Michonne is a lot more apprehensive toward letting anyone join. Something we'd soon learn has a very dark explanation. And speaking of Magna, let's catch up to what they're up to in the books. And there, like I just said, their purpose is a lot more clear. Ever since they joined Alexandria, the only thing they've been thinking is that this place is too good to be true. And so, literally the only thing Magna is looking out for are those dark undertones. Basically, just think of Michonne and Woodbury in the TV version. And sort of unfortunately for us, we do in fact have one secret: Negan. And so, despite Rick openly telling her that yes, they do have this prisoner, and that he would happily tell her all about it after he returns from Hilltop, Magna is still very sus. And so, with Rick gone, they all sneak around to the cell, and there, ever the charmer, Negan starts screaming and shouting about how he's being kept like an animal and that these people are monsters. Basically, he is throwing everything at the wall and just seeing what'll stick. But, in classic Kirkman-like fashion, this was just cheeky bait because literally the very next issue opens with Magna blatantly saying, "I have seen what torture does to people. You have never been tortured," prompting Negan to immediately drop the act and nonchalantly then introduce himself properly, just saying, "Yes, I've been bored." Broadly speaking, this entire Negan visit really changes nothing in the grand scheme of things, so I think it's pretty clear why it was omitted from the show. To be totally honest with you, I do think this is just Kirkman messing with us and just wanting us to be uneasy, and so he threw in this cliffhanger that is entirely resolved in the very next issue. The TV version simply remixed that apprehension of Magna's to be more so from both sides, with Michonne too not really wanting to accept them. Another pretty substantial remix in the show is everything regarding Gabriel. With Gabe, he sort of surpasses his comic counterpart simply because in the book he was never really meant to be a forefront character. So basically everything following this point is almost entirely new for the show, including the entire amplifier thing we see here. Which, to be honest with you, I do find of odd considering this was always a Eugene thing, but he was now the one actually going outside of the walls, which I do think is kinda weird. Of course, we must also remember that we are now 9+ years deep into the apocalypse as opposed to the comics 2 or 3, but I still find it a little odd considering they pushed their strategist and effectively brains of the group beyond the walls. Though when taken in isolation, yes, Gabriel is a far more interesting character in the TV version, and frankly it's not even a contest. And in terms of the radio, I think this is just even more foreshadowing, or I guess a comic parallel to Eugene making contact with Stephanie. Jumping on over to the Grimes household, we see Michonne and Judith talk a little more about Magna's group and a whole bunch of other things. But yet again, I just can't help but roll my eyes here. I really don't know what the problem with the industry is on this front, but can we please just stop making kids talk like adults? I am sorry, like, Judith is 9 years old. And here she is morally and intellectually challenging Michonne, talking about how her loved ones' voices are fading, etc, etc. Like, come on, when I was 9, the most morally complex problem I had to deal with was whether or not to ninja loot WoW gear and whether I should have fries with my chicky tendies. I generally really like Judith as a character and what she represents, and I honestly think Haley Fleming is easily one of the most talented younger actors I've seen in a while. But when it comes to the material that's actually given to her, it almost seems like no one had ever met a 9-year-old before. And with this being a retrospective, I think I'd be doing you a disservice if we didn't once again look at the meta implications. Because entertain this idea for me. Don't you think it would have been quite handy if we had a totally grown-up Grimes who is also a total gigachat who also grew up in the apocalypse, and now the actor's age would have finally matched the in-universe age of the character? Huh. Oh, and you know, maybe after their father's supposed death, this character becomes so protective of their little sister that we can actually have them running around together exactly because this character thinks that the only safe place for them is by his side. And yeah, I know, I'm just throwing out hypothetics. We've never really had a character like that, right? So, I mean, I'm kind of wasting time talking about it, but wouldn't that be handy? Just think about that, you know? Maybe. We'll obviously talk about this a whole lot more later, but while I do think Judith ultimately did turn out to be a really cool character, I think she just really suffered from the usual kids talk like adults problem that seemingly plagues almost every other story out there. Honestly, I don't think you even need to look far to find a better execution of this. Telltale's first season of The Walking Dead literally follows a 8 to 9-year-old Clementine, who, in my mind, acts much more like a 8 or 9-year-old. And yes, I do suppose you can say that, well, she grew up in this environment and maybe that's why she's like that, but I still think she is just too smart for an 8 or 9-year-old. It's not that she talks in a specific way, it's just that she talks too intelligently. But whatever the case, another scene with Judith we see here is her talking to Negan. This is a pretty obvious nod to Carl having these talks, but it is of course very different. Though when it comes to Judith and Negan, this is a huge W for the TV version in my opinion. I can't even really tell you what exactly it was about their relationship, but I absolutely love their dynamic and honestly wish we got to see more of it. Though to be fair, Judith was just super wholesome with literally anybody she talked to, so maybe it's just that, I don't know. Another major add-in here is Michonne's ambiguous X scar, which shows up right after the time skip. Absolutely nothing even remotely close to this ever happens in the book. And while I do think the whole cult of children turned out to be a little too tropey, I've gotta admit, it is easily some of the darkest and most interesting stuff in the later seasons for me. For simplicity's sake, we'll get to all of that later on, but yeah, while it is a very common trope, I cannot deny I loved it. Returning to the book for a bit though, we see some more classic teenage angst over at the Hilltop. Brian, and don't worry, you don't need to remember his name, he is totally irrelevant, is being bullied by a couple of dudes. Though moments later, Sophia shows up, beats up the both of them, and basically tells them to get lost. And amusingly, when Carl walks by and sees what's going on, she instinctively also gives him a solid smack over the face. prompting him to then joke around saying, "Oh, you know, it's not like I only have one good eye left or anything. You don't need to remember about the Brian lad, but do remember this whole bully stuff, it will be super important later on." Similarly, like I already mentioned before, the whole blacksmithing apprentice debacle is also squashed here as Carl goes to talk to Earl and comes clean about why he is here in the first place. In the show, there are also some comparable stories with Henry here and the shenanigans he gets into, but because the show seemingly has a weird fascination with killing off characters with a conflicted upbringing, it's not like any of these would ultimately really matter now, would they? More on that soon. Jumping on over to Marco and Ken, if you recall, they veered off the cleared out patrol routes when they spotted some wild horses. Though soon thereafter, they ran into walkers and lost not only the wild horses, but also their own. And so, we pick up with them just trying to outrun the walkers. Something that isn't exactly easy when Ken's leg is pretty badly messed up. And so, they soon find themselves in a very sticky situation where they can no longer outrun the horde and simply have to hide. They slide down the side of this hill, but then, as we linger on their already terrified faces, they suddenly hear, "Where they go? Don't know. Keep moving." Back at the hilltop, while Rick and Maggie are catching up, the community is suddenly alerted by a patrol guard dragging in the starving and dehydrated Marco. And just to clear up any confusion, because of how the story is told and because I'm drawing these direct comparisons, yes, the timeline here is obviously very skewed, but canonically, Marco and Ken go through all of this even before Rick and Carl arrive at the hilltop. So in actuality, multiple days have already passed since all of that happens. So yes, fret not, they have not unlocked warp drives yet, this is just how I structured the video. Though as he is brought in, we get the ever-iconic scene of him waking up and being shaken to his very core. He simply begs them to find Ken, but at the same time, he seems almost nonsensical. He is just so distraught and almost disturbed by whatever happens. And then, as he's covering his ears with the pillow, he drops the line of, "There were whispers, and I was afraid. It was the dead. They were speaking."
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
Now, let me tell you, when we saw this entire thing go down in the comics, the community was set ablaze with speculation. Some people thought it could be previously unseen types of walkers. Some thought it could be walkers who potentially never ran out of food and somehow redeveloped the ability to speak. Some people thought that maybe as time went on and now that we are 2 years deep into the apocalypse, the walkers somehow change. Some people thought that maybe there was a cult or something who deliberately mutilated themselves to appear as walkers. And of course, some already figured it out exactly and said that these are likely people in disguises. And also, yes, I do have to give some props to Kirkman here, because clearly, he was already playing some mind games with us with this being set in a storm. Something we know for a fact would immediately invalidate the entire zombie guts tactic we've seen thus far, since it would all just wash off, right? But point is that, once again, Kirkman managed to throw us such a curveball that absolutely all of this was uncharted territory to a previously unseen degree. And at the same time, with a mere handful of panels, completely revitalized the threat of walkers that seemed all but defeated. As for the show's version, in many ways it plays out almost one-to-one, and it's only the wider implications that differ. And obviously, unlike Ken and Marco, who were at best C-tier characters in terms of importance, the show sent out two very heavy hitters in Eugene and Rosita. Unfortunately, the surprise was obviously spoiled for me here, so I can only really tell you that I think the show captured that sense of sheer horror very well as well. And while I do still think that letting Eugene go outside of the walls was a little goofy, I do also admit it creates a much more spooky atmosphere because this is Eugene telling them about what happened. He is literally the most science and fact-minded person we know. And here he is telling them that the walkers are speaking. Here, I would once again like to pass off the question to you TV onlys. What was your initial impression of what we saw here? Did you believe Eugene? Did you have some theories of your own? Do let me know. Though yes, sort of like the comic where only Marco is brought back, Rosita leaves Eugene in the barn and that is where we leave them for now. And returning to the book for a bit, it is here where Kirkman straight up chose violence. And if I had to quickly summarize everything to follow, I would just say that he set up some of the most intense juxtapositions we had ever seen in the story thus far. And that says a lot considering what happened in the comic version of the prison story. But yes, all of that begins with the issue literally titled Happiness, one whose cover prominently features Maggie and baby Herschel, clearly signifying the next generation and just how far the survivors have come. This issue has a very clear dual narrative structure, one told through Rick's day at the Hilltop, and the other through Dante's squad who are sent out to search for Ken. And to say that they were meant to be directly opposed would be the understatement of the century. But again, for clarity's sake, we will tackle them separately. In the Hilltop, we once again see Rick and Maggie just talk about how far they've come, how large the Hilltop is now, and so on. They have this communal dinner, briefly talk about how Rick misses Michonne, yes, we are still talking about the comic version here, and to hammer home all of that, we get this sequence of panels with Rick, Maggie, baby Herschel, Carl, and Sophia, all watching the sunset together in what is easily one of the most peaceful scenes in all of the comic book. We even get this tiny scene of Maggie asking baby Herschel whether he can say the word sunset, only for him to respond,
"Sunset."
Yes, that's exactly how he sounded, trust me. And we then zoom out just to see all of them relaxing on the porch and just sharing this moment together. In the show, the whole Hilltop story is quite a bit different. First off, a whole bunch of characters converge on the Hilltop at the same time, so the larger story structure is also different in that sense. But when it comes to Michonne, she agrees to lead Magna's group there, and they then have this brief excursion where we also see this large container laying on what was their camp, which is a pretty clear nod to their movable container we saw in the book, but generally they just have their own little adventure on their way to the Hilltop. When they arrive though, we see another huge remix, as the guards of the Hilltop immediately yell out that riders are approaching and everyone scatters. An absolute far cry from the book where, once Rick saw the community, it was this picturesque view of everyone working side by side and even children just playing out in the rain. And like I mentioned, it's also here where Carol and Henry arrive at the Hilltop, and so we see Michonne and her reconnect. Carol asks Michonne about them joining the fair. Michonne, though, promptly shuts it down, again hinting at something that must have happened to sort of isolate the communities more so than we had seen thus far. And it's also here where the whole broken world conversation happens that I mentioned before. Michonne says the travel is too dangerous and the distance is too great between them, which yet again brings up the question of, okay, but why is your daughter running around the woods again? But I digress. Returning to our search though, Dante's squad is sent out in search of Ken. Though before they do, we also get some pretty clear romantic undertones of Maggie playfully telling him that yes, she is indeed sending him into the jaws of danger. More on that in the future. In the show, on the other hand, once Rosita wakes up, she effectively says the same thing as Marco. They saw something out there and they are not ready for it. And with that, in the show too, a squad is sent out in search of Eugene. And again, only major difference being that in the show, it isn't just Dante with a couple of minor characters. This is literally Aaron, Daryl, and Jesus. Each and every one of them is a very, very heavy hitter on the cast. And the way they piece together what's actually going on here is also quite a bit different. The comic once again opts for this more shocking approach of it's simply happening and now you are left to deal with the consequences. The show, on the other hand, as it usually does, builds up to that horror a little more gradually. Also, in the book, they simply search for the barn and that's about it. There are a few discussions among them whether or not they should just give up the search, but nothing really spooky happens as of yet. In the show, on the other hand, they quickly notice this horde exhibiting some really odd movements. And basically everything following this point in the show, I think, was executed to perfection. Okay, not Jesus' death, but that's different. In the show, obviously this entire thing is set on the obligatory foggy Halloween-esque night where they search around this dark forest with just this one barn in the middle. And as they find Eugene, the whole horror aspect just shoots right up to 11 as he too is just absolutely mortified. The comic though simply has Dante's squad come across this barn, though as they search it, they only ever find his belongings there. And as they're searching, and don't forget, we also cut to the extremely wholesome scenes of Rick and Maggie, they are suddenly overrun by what seems to be normal walkers. And because this sequence here has so much to talk about, this is where I'll leave it for today. There are a number of meta factors here which push the story in a number of different directions, which I certainly want to talk about in depth, as well as several changes from the book which would also change the larger scale narrative being told. So yeah, I am sorry to pull a cliffhanger on you, but let us do the sequence justice. And so with that, I hope to see you back next time as we get to our very first confrontation with the Whispers, and talk about the so-called evolution of walkers and how that shaped the rest of the season. And that's the video. Season 9 is already shaping up to be a Season 6 situation, with us barely being at the mid-season point and already 3 videos in. But hey, that just means there's a lot to talk about, right? But with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Mahmoud Farhood, I guess, sorry if I butchered the name. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!